Hello and welcome, I'm Ken Gowdy from Sax Comprehensive, and in this video we will explore some ways how the diminished scale can be used when improvising over diminished and dominant chords. The diminished scale is a scale that follows a repeated pattern of tone, half tone, tone, half tone, tone, half tone, etc. and as such can be created starting on any note using this pattern. However, because the scale is symmetrical, it will repeat every 3 half tones. So there are only really 3 diminished scales. That is, all the other diminished scales have the same notes as one of these, but the only difference being that the scale will start on a different note. This is the C diminished scale, which has the same notes as the E flat, G flat and A diminished scale. If we look closer at the scale, we will realize that each scale will contain all of the chord tones of certain diminished and dominant 7th chords. This means that we can use the diminished scale to improvise over diminished and dominant chords. One way to work out what diminished scale to use over a dominant chord is to play the diminished scale a half tone above the dominant chord. For example, if we had a B7 chord, since C is a half tone above B, we would play the C diminished scale over this chord. And as we saw before, the C diminished scale has all of the chord tones of the B7 chord. Since the scale repeats every 3 half tones, this means that we could also use the E flat, G flat and A diminished scale over this B7 chord, since all of the scales have the same notes. By playing the diminished scale over the relevant dominant chord, we bring out the flatter 9th, the sharp 9th, the sharp 11th and 13th extension of the chord. Since the diminished 7th chord only appears occasionally in a piece of music, let's look at some examples of improvising over a dominant chord in a 2-5-1 progression, which will occur more often. Here is a simple melody over a 2-5-1 progression. We will change this melody by removing the notes over the dominant chord and by replacing it with a diminished scale pattern. Here are some common scale patterns using the notes of the diminished scale. We will start with this simple melody over a 2-5-1. We will remove the melody over the dominant chord and replace it with a diminished scale pattern similar to the ones we've just looked at. We will start this scale pattern on a note close to the last note of the previous section so that there is a smooth transition. I will leave the last section as it is. So by adding a scale pattern, we can easily transform a melody. To make it more interesting, we would have to add some articulation and rhythm to it rather than just playing it as 8th notes. Better still, we can learn the melodies of some of the great saxophone players and adapt them. Though having said that, you may find that some of these great saxophone players also use some form of scale patterns in their melodies. Lastly, I started this video by saying the diminished scale follows a pattern of tone, half tone, tone, half tone, etc. This gives the scale its other name of the whole half diminished scale or fully diminished scale. Some musicians argue that there are 2 types of diminished scales. The other follows the pattern of half tone, tone, half tone, tone, and as a result is called the half whole diminished scale or the dominant diminished scale, dom-dim for short. So for example, looking at the G sharp fully diminished scale, which we use to improvise over the G7 chord, if we start the scale on the G, we will still have the same notes, but the scale will follow the pattern of half tone, tone, half tone, tone. So these 2 scales, which have the same notes, are modes of each other. Understanding the scale in this way may make it easier when improvising. For example, when improvising over a G7 chord, you could use the fully diminished scale a half tone above the chord, that is the G sharp fully diminished scale, or you could use the G dominant diminished scale. This has the advantage that you do not need to think in terms of the diminished scale a half tone above the chord. However, it will mean that you'll have to learn another set of diminished scales. But fortunately, like the fully diminished scale, there are only 3 scales to learn. So to recap, if you're improvising over a diminished 7 chord, use the fully diminished scale of the same name. If you're improvising over a dominant chord, either use the fully diminished scale a half tone above the chord, or use the dominant diminished scale of the same name. In conclusion, let me say thank you for watching this video. Hopefully you found it helpful and informative. If you did, as usual, give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.